The transport truck rolled through the gates of Camp Hearn under a sun that turned the ground into copper and the air into dust. Guard towers stood like punctuation marks against a sky too blue to look at for long. Eight German women rode in the back with leg irons locked around their ankles. Thought of his wife, gone 3 years now, who used to say cruelty was never an accident, only a decision someone chose not to think about. He entered the administration building and found Captain James Morrison in an office that smelled of paper and dust. Morrison was the camp commander, the man responsible for keeping order, preventing trouble, protecting the camp's reputation, and making sure everything looked correct on every report. He said 3 words. "Take them off." Morrison looked up. "Jack." "What?" "The leg irons," McKenna said. "Take 'em off now. Before you process them, before you march them around like it's normal." Morrison's mouth tightened. "Transport protocol. Descending facility. Applied restraints. We remove them after intake." McKenna held his gaze. "They're not dangerous. It's procedure," Morrison said, as if the word itself was a shield. "It's unnecessary," McKenna replied, "and it's humiliating." Morrison leaned back, weighing consequences the way officers always did. Order wasn't just discipline, it was safety. And in a POW camp, every deviation created questions. Questions became paperwork. Paperwork became inspections. Inspections became crackdowns. "Why do you care?" Morrison asked. Not unkind, but real. "You've watched prisoners come through here for 2 years." McKenna didn't blink. "Because I just watched a woman fall because she couldn't walk like a person." Morrison didn't answer. McKenna added, quieter now. "Because I've got a daughter her age. Because we keep telling ourselves we're better than what we're fighting. This is the part where you prove it." Morrison glanced at the manual on his desk, the thick comfort of rules, procedures, authorized behavior. The manual had pages for security, pages for control, pages for discipline. But what it didn't have was a page for this exact moment. 8 women who posed no real threat being treated like high-risk criminals. Because it was easier to keep doing what had always been done. Morrison said nothing for a long beat. Then, estud. He picked up the phone and called Sergeant Hayes. Bring the new arrivals into the yard, Morrison sighed before processing. I'm addressing them. There was a pause. Sir. Proceeder now, Morrison sighed. 10 minutes later, the 8 women stood in the yard, still shackled, still silent. Guards flanked them, nearby. German male prisoners working on details slowed down. Some stopped completely. Word traveled fast inside wire. Morrison stepped forward and spoke in careful German, clear enough to be understood even if his accent wasn't perfect. You are prisoners of war under Geneva Convention protection, he said. You will be treated fairly. You will receive food, shelter, and medical care. You will work only in capacities allowed under the rules. You will not be mistreated. The women didn't react. Their faces stayed controlled, but their eyes tracked him measuring, listening, trying to decide what was real. Morrison paused, then gestured to Hayes. Remove the leg irons. Hayes froze for a fraction of a second. Sir, transport security, I'm aware, Morrison said. Remove them. Hayes stepped forward with keys and knelt in the dirt in front of the first woman. The one who had fallen. She stared at him, expression unreadable, as if any movement of emotion might be used against her later. The key turned. Metal clicked. Morrison finally lifted his eyes. About what? About precedent, Hayes said. If women get special treatment, men will ask why they don't. If prisoners start expecting mercy before it's earned, discipline gets complicated. Morrison took in the sentence and translated it into what it really meant. If this gets noticed, you will be audited. If you are audited, you will be restricted. If you are restricted, you lose discretion. And discretion was the only space where humanity fit. Morrison dismissed Hayes with a short nod, then picked up the phone and called Jack McKenna. McKenna arrived that evening with dust on his boots and the same expression he wore when a fence line had to be reset patient. Stubborn, unavoidable. You got your wish. Morrison sighed. McKenna removed his hat, placed it on his knee. I saw. Morrison tapped the report with one finger. You know what this invites? Yeah, McKenna said. Questions from people who never had to watch a woman fall in chains. Morrison leaned back. It's not just questions. If headquarters decides this camp is getting loose, they can send an inspector. They can change protocols. They can cut work programs. They can remove civilian discretion. McKenna's eyes narrowed. So we do nothing because someone might frown. Morrison's voice stayed even, but tired. We do nothing reckless because hundreds of prisoners and guards live inside the consequences. McKenna didn't flinch. And we do nothing human because we're scared of paperwork. That landed harder than it should have. Morrison stared at the report, then at the manual on the shelf, then back at McKenna. You think I don't know? Morrison said quietly. You think I didn't see their faces when the irons came off? I did. And I also see the bigger picture. One bad inspection and this camp tightens like a noose. McKenna leaned forward. Then be smarter than the inspection. Make it defensible. Put your mercy into language they can't punish. That night, Morrison sat alone and wrote a memo. Not an apology. Not a confession. A justification. He framed the early removal as a safety improvement, reducing fall risks, preventing injury, preserving labor capability, maintaining order by preventing an avoidable incident. He used the system's own words against its cold instincts. He did not mention dignity. He did not mention that it was simply wrong. He made mercy look like efficiency. And that, he knew, was how you kept it alive. 2 days later, Greta was assigned to a farm work detail. When the list went up on the board, she felt a compound shift around her. Not fear exactly, something sharper. Awareness, women whispered. Some looked relieved it wasn't them. Some looked jealous because farm work meant fresh air, distance from the barracks, meals that weren't cooked for hundreds at once. But Greta's stomach tightened for a different reason. Outside camp meant fewer eyes. Outside camp meant the rules still existed, but the atmosphere changed. Outside camp meant you were a prisoner on somebody else's land, and the smallest misunderstanding could turn into a report. Helen Richter caught her before she packed her small kit. Listen to me, Helen said. You've been here 12 days. You already carry a story. Do not add fuel to it. Greta frowned. I didn't do anything. That's the point, Helen replied. You didn't. And the story still found you. Greta didn't answer, because she knew what Helen meant. A narrative didn't require your permission. It only required your existence. The next morning, Jack McKenna drove her out in his truck. The road stretched long and pale through open Texas landlow scrub. Fence lines, cattle in the distance, sky so wide it made you feel small on purpose. McKenna kept both hands on the wheel, eyes forward. Greta sat stiffly, her uniform collar hot against her neck. After several miles, she spoke in careful English. Why? You take me. McKenna glanced at her, then back to the road. Because you speak English. Because you've worked farms. Because Hendersons need help. And because I promised you'd be treated right. Greta watched the landscape pass and tried to decide if promises meant anything in a war. McKenna continued, as if he could hear the question she wasn't asking. And because, he said, I don't want trouble. Not for you. Not for them. Not for the camp. That was the first time Greta understood that kindness had a shadow. Not because it wasn't real, because it could be punished. The Henderson farm sat 15 miles outside camp-wide fields. Catle pasture small orchards. Sheds and barns laid out like the working map of a family's survival. James Henderson met them at the fence line, a man in his 50s, with a sun-worn face and hands that looked like they had never had the option of softness. His wife, Marie, stood behind him with an apron on, practical eyes that measured work the way a scale measures grain. They had used prisoner labor before. They knew the rules. They also knew the reality. Labor shortages, sons overseas crops that didn't care about moral debates. Marie looked at Greta and asked, not unkindly, "You understand English?" Greta nodded. "Yes. Some." "That's enough," Marie said. "You work hard, you eat. Fair deal." Greta waited for the edge contempt, coldness, something to match the images she had been fed. It didn't come. They walked her to the work area. Jim showed her the row and the method. He didn't bark. He demonstrated. He corrected once, gently. He treated her like what she was in that moment. Labor at noon, Marie called them in. Inside the farmhouse kitchen, the air smelled of bread and cooked vegetables. The table was set like this was normal, like it had been waiting for this moment all along. And there it was on the table. A pitcher of sweet tea. Greta's throat went dry. She stared at it too long, and Marie noticed. "It's just tea," Marie said, as if explaining a weather fact. Greta didn't reach for it. McKenna watched her, then spoke quietly in German. "You don't have to drink it." Greta's hands remained on her knees. In her mind, old training flickered like a film. Enemy hospitality, hidden cost, bait, and consequence. She had expected cruelty. She had prepared for cruelty. She was not prepared for ordinary. Marie poured herself a glass and drank first, casually, without ceremony. No performance. No demand. "You got family back home?" he asked. "You worried?" Greta swallowed. "Yes." Jim's jaw flexed. "I got boys overseas. I worry every day." Greta looked at him, confused. "They fight. Germans." "Yeah," he said. "And you're here." "Instead," Jim said, "I'm fighting to get my boys home. Hating you doesn't do that." Greta's chest felt tight. She had been taught that enemies were clean categories, that you could sort the world into right and wrong and then act accordingly. But here was a man with sons at war, feeding an enemy prisoner in his kitchen, as if that act didn't weaken him. It unsettled her more than hunger ever had. That evening, back in the truck, Greta stared out at the horizon and finally spoke the thought that frightened her most. "If this continues," she said carefully in English, "camp. Let us work farms. Kind things. People talk. Rules change." McKenna's face stayed forward. "You're learning quick." Greta turned to him. "If inspector comes, if report, farm duties stop." McKenna nodded once. Could happen. The admission was like a cold splash, because now the stakes weren't only emotional. A single complaint from a neighbor. And suddenly, It breeds trouble. It breeds hate. But lately, he suspected it was also about resisting what hate did to ordinary people, not with speeches. and social contact. No fraternization beyond work requirements. Collins raised an eyebrow. Hospitality can blur lines. Morrison met his gaze. So can cruelty. That earned him a look, not anger, not approval. Calculation. That evening, McKenna sat on the tailgate of his truck outside the compound while Greta and the other women were marched back inside. "You okay?" he asked her quietly. Greta hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, but they are looking." McKenna sighed. "They always are." Inside the barracks, the mood shifted. Some women were angry. "Why risk this?" One whispered. "Why farms, tea, gardens? We survive without these." Others were afraid. If they cut it all off, it will be worse than before. Greta lay on her bunk and stared at the ceiling boards again. She realized something unsettling. Kindness had become a dependency. Not because it was weak, but because it had reminded them what normal felt like, and losing normal hurt more than never having it. 2 days later, the second sign came. Unnoticed, went up on the board. All work details temporarily suspended pending review. No explanation. No timeline. Just waiting. The camp felt smaller without movement. Time thickened. Meals tasted flatter. Even the guards seemed tense, aware they were part of a test they hadn't asked for. That night, Greta heard raised voices outside. She recognized McKenna's tone, controlled, but hard. "This is unnecessary," he said. A guard replied. "Orders from above. You've got no incident reports. No escapes. No violations." "Doesn't matter," the guard said. "Perception does." Greta closed her eyes. Perception. The word that had built empires and destroyed lives. The next morning, Morrison was summoned. Colonel Rowlands, district commander, sat behind a desk that smelled of ink and old paper. "Captain," Rowlands said, "you've run a clean camp." "That's not in question." Morrison waited. "But there's concern. You're letting personal judgment override standardization." Morrison nodded. "I am." Rowlands leaned back. "You know why we standardize?" "Yes, sir." "So no one man's conscience becomes policy." Morrison chose his words carefully. "With respect, sir, policy exists to prevent abuse, not to mandate it." Rowlands studied him for a long moment. "You're walking a thin line." Yes. And still you say no. She met his eyes. Because they removed chains, they didn't have to. Because they treated dignity as default, not reward. Her mother whispered, "Why would enemies do that?" Greta answered without hesitation, because someone decided rules were incomplete. She began working almost immediately, first on farms, then teaching children displaced by bombing. She spoke often, carefully, honestly, not propaganda. Witness. She told them about Texas heat, about a cowboy who watched a woman fall and refused to accept it, about a commander who chose responsibility over comfort, about a family who fed an enemy girl without asking her to apologize for existing. Years passed, Germany rebuilt slowly, imperfectly. Greta Merritt had children, taught them history the way she had lived it, not as slogans, but as consequences. In 1965, she returned to Texas. She found the Henderson farm smaller, quieter. Marie's hair was white. Jim's hands shook. McKenna walked slower but still straight-backed. They sat on the porch at sunset. "I never thanked you properly," Greta said. McKenna waved it off. "You already did by living well." "No," she said. "You need to know what you did, followed me home. It changed how I rebuilt my country, how I raised my children, how I teach others to see power." He looked uncomfortable. "All I did was say take him off." "Yes," Greta replied, "and everything changed after." McKenna died in 1973. At his funeral, among family and ranch hands, 3 foreign women stood quietly. They placed a simple wreath at the grave. No one asked who they were. They didn't need to. Decades later, Camp Hearn was dismantled. Towers removed, wire cuts. The land returned to dust and grass. Nothing marked where the women once stood in chains. Nothing marked where the order was given. But somewhere in Germany, children learned that enemies could choose decency. Somewhere in Texas, a story was passed down about a man who fixed what was broken even when it was only dignity. History would record battles and treaties, but the truth lived elsewhere. In one sentence spoken under a copper sky, in one silence that followed, in the understanding that systems do not become humane on their own. People make them so, and sometimes the most powerful act in a war is not conquest, but removing chains when no one forces you to.